Mom spent her whole life begging this family to love her. Tonight was the first time I realized you never did. The moment my daughter said those words, nobody at the dinner table could look at me anymore. My mother's wine glass trembled in her hand. My father stared down at his untouched steak. My sister Linda's smile disappeared so quickly it was almost frightening. And for the first time in 67 years, I stopped trying to make everyone comfortable. 6 hours earlier, I had stood in my bedroom staring at a black dress hanging beside a pale blue sweater, trying to decide which version of myself my family would tolerate better that night. The grieving widow or the dependable daughter who never caused problems. In the end, I chose the sweater. It felt softer, less dramatic. Richard used to love that color on me. My husband had been gone for 23 days. 23 mornings of waking up and instinctively reaching across cold sheets before remembering there was nobody there anymore. 23 nights of eating alone at a kitchen table built for 4. I still hadn't moved his reading glasses from the counter. I still couldn't wash the coffee mug he used the morning before his heart gave out. Claire told me I didn't have to go to the dinner. Mom, she'd said over the phone that morning, you're exhausted. Grandma can celebrate Aunt Linda without you for one night. But I heard the hesitation in her voice. Claire already knew what I refused to admit. If I didn't go, my absence would become another reason for the family to call me difficult, emotional, oversensitive. So I curled my hair carefully, applied lipstick with trembling hands, and wrapped Linda's birthday gift in silver paper while trying not to cry onto the ribbon. The drive to my parents' house took 40 minutes. The sun was beginning to set over the Connecticut suburbs, washing the streets in soft gold light that reminded me painfully of autumn evenings Richard and I used to spend driving nowhere in particular. He always liked taking the scenic route. My hands tightened around the steering wheel at the memory. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, the house was glowing with warm yellow light. Cars lined both sides of the curb. I sat inside my sedan for a moment longer than necessary, staring through the windshield while laughter drifted faintly from the backyard. Nobody knew I was there yet. For one peaceful moment, I could still leave. But then Claire's car pulled in beside mine. My daughter stepped out holding a store-bought cheesecake balanced carefully in both hands. At 32, Claire had Richard's gentle eyes and my tendency to notice things nobody else wanted to discuss. She smiled when she saw me, but it faded quickly. You okay? She asked softly after climbing out. I forced a nod. Of course. She looked at me for another second, unconvinced. You don't have to pretend with me, Mom. I swallowed hard and adjusted the strap of my purse. Let's just get through tonight. Music floated from the backyard as we walked toward the gate. Somebody had hung white lanterns along the fence. I could smell grilled salmon and rosemary potatoes. Linda always loved elaborate birthdays. My mother opened the sliding glass door the moment she noticed us. There you are, she said brightly, air-kissing Claire before giving me a quick side hug that barely touched my shoulder. We were about to start appetizers. Not, how are you holding up? Not, I've been worried about you. Just appetizers. The backyard looked beautiful. Long tables covered in ivory linen stretched across the patio. Candles flickered inside glass jars. Linda sat at the center wearing a cream-colored dress, laughing loudly while my father refilled her wine glass. Nobody stopped talking when I arrived. Nobody asked how I'd been sleeping since the funeral. My nephew Josh walked past me carrying a tray of drinks and nearly bumped into my arm without apologizing. Claire noticed. I saw it in the way her jaw tightened slightly. Evelyn. Linda finally called out from across the patio. You made it. Made it. As though attending my own family gathering while grieving my husband was some impressive social accomplishment. I smiled politely and handed her the wrapped gift. Happy birthday. Linda accepted it without standing up. You didn't have to get me anything. But she tore into the wrapping paper immediately anyway. My mother leaned toward her excitedly while I remained standing beside the table, suddenly unsure where I belonged. Every seat seemed filled. Every conversation already complete without me. Claire quietly pulled out an empty chair near the far end of the table and touched my elbow gently. Sit with me, she whispered. I lowered myself into the chair while laughter rose around us again. My father started telling a story about Linda's vacation in Napa Valley. My mother interrupted twice just to praise Linda's resilience after her recent divorce. Across the table, someone asked Linda whether she planned to start dating again soon. Nobody mentioned Richard. Nobody mentioned that less than a month ago, I stood beside a gravesite trying to understand how 42 years of marriage could disappear into silence so quickly. I folded my napkin carefully into my lap and stared at the candle flickering between the salt and pepper shakers. Then my mother lifted her wine glass and smiled warmly at everyone except me. Tonight, she announced proudly, is about celebrating joy. We've had enough sadness lately. Claire slowly turned her head toward me, and in that moment, something inside my daughter changed. I tried to focus on the candlelight instead of the ache spreading slowly through my chest. The tiny flames reflected against the glass jars on the table, soft and warm and ordinary, as though this were just another family dinner instead of the first one I had attended without Richard in more than 4 decades. My mother continued talking about Linda's upcoming trip to Charleston, while servers from the catering company carried out plates of roasted vegetables and salmon. The rental house has a private dock, Linda said proudly, taking another sip of wine. And apparently there is a spa only 10 minutes away. You deserve it after everything you have been through, my mother replied immediately. Claire glanced at me across the table. I looked down at my water glass before she could see the expression on my face. After everything you have been through. I wondered briefly what counted as hardship in this family and what did not. Apparently divorce qualified. Losing your husband of 42 years did not. The conversation flowed around me like water moving around a stone in the middle of a stream. My nephew Josh talked about a promotion at work. Linda interrupted twice to complain about airline prices. My father laughed louder than necessary at one of her jokes, the same forced laugh he used whenever he wanted to keep peace in the room. Nobody asked me a single question for nearly 20 minutes. Not how I was sleeping. Not whether I had eaten properly since the funeral. Not whether I still reached for Richard in the middle of the night before remembering he was gone. Claire noticed everything. She always did. Every time somebody spoke over me, her shoulders stiffened slightly. Every time my mother redirected attention back to Linda, Claire's jaw tightened a little more. I tried giving her small, reassuring smiles, the kind mothers give their children when they want them to believe things are fine. But I could tell she was beginning to understand something I had spent years hiding even from myself. This was not accidental. Halfway through dinner, my mother passed around old family photo albums she had apparently brought downstairs for Linda's birthday. Remember this one? She laughed, sliding an album toward my sister. You were so beautiful at your college graduation. Linda grinned while everyone leaned closer to admire the photographs. I recognized the album immediately. Brown leather cover. Gold corners. My mother used to keep it in the living room cabinet beside the Christmas china. I had helped organize those photographs years ago. There were pictures from vacations, birthdays, school plays, anniversaries. Entire decades pressed carefully beneath plastic sleeves. Claire quietly reached over and turned one of the pages. A photograph of Richard and me appeared for barely a second before my mother quickly flipped past it. So quickly it almost felt rehearsed. My throat tightened. Richard stood beside me in that picture wearing a navy blazer and smiling into the camera while I leaned against his shoulder during our 20th anniversary dinner in Boston. I remembered the restaurant, overlooking the harbor. I remembered the way he held my hand across the table while rain tapped softly against the windows. But the photograph disappeared before anybody else even acknowledged it existed. My mother continued speaking without pause. Oh, here is Linda at Cape Cod. She looked stunning that summer. Claire slowly closed the album. The sound was quiet, but somehow it cut through the table chatter for a moment. My father glanced at her briefly before looking away again. I folded my hands carefully in my lap because they had started shaking slightly. Grief does strange things to time. Some moments pass so slowly you can feel every second scraping against your ribs. Others disappear before you can fully understand them. Sitting at that table, I realized I could remember every flower arrangement from Richard's funeral, but could barely remember the last genuine conversation my mother had with me. A waiter approached to refill drinks. More wine? He asked politely, stopping beside me. Before I could answer, my mother interrupted from across the table. Oh, Evelyn probably should not. She has been emotional lately. The sentence landed softly, quietly, but I felt it all the same. Emotional lately. As though grief were some embarrassing personality flaw I needed to manage better for everyone else's comfort. Claire set down her fork carefully. Mom is doing fine, she said evenly. My mother blinked at her with mild surprise. I was only concerned. Interesting timing for concern, Claire replied. The table fell briefly silent. Linda gave a short, uncomfortable laugh and reached for her wine again. "Well," she said brightly, "this evening is supposed to stay positive." Positive. That word stayed with me. I stared down at my untouched salmon while memories began surfacing one after another with painful clarity. Last Thanksgiving, when Linda changed the dinner reservation without telling me because she wanted a smaller group. The Christmas before that, when my parents drove 2 hours to attend Linda's neighborhood holiday party but claimed the roads were too icy to visit Richard after his surgery. The afternoon my mother forgot our anniversary entirely but mailed Linda flowers for completing a yoga certification. Tiny moments. Small exclusions. Quiet disappointments I had spent decades explaining away because admitting the truth felt too cruel. Claire leaned closer toward me. "Do you want to leave?" she whispered softly. I almost said yes. The word sat right there behind my teeth. But then my father raised his wine glass suddenly. "To family," he announced with a smile. Everyone lifted their glasses automatically. Claire did not. Neither did I. My father hesitated awkwardly before continuing anyway. "To staying strong during difficult seasons." I nearly laughed at that. Not because it was funny. Because it was astonishing. They wanted my strength. They admired my silence. They depended on my ability to absorb hurt without disturbing the room. But they had never once wanted my pain. And for the first time in my life, I realized those were not the same thing at all. Dessert arrived 15 minutes later on delicate white plates dusted with powdered sugar. My mother insisted everyone sing for Linda before the cake was cut. Candles flickered beneath the backyard lights while my sister smiled at the center of the table like somebody accepting an award she had always known belonged to her. I watched quietly as everyone leaned in around her. My father rested a proud hand on Linda's shoulder. Josh pulled out his phone to record the moment. Even the neighbors my parents had invited seemed more emotionally connected to my family than I felt sitting there. Claire remained very still beside me. I could always tell when she was upset because she stopped fidgeting completely. Her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her face calm in a way that looked almost too controlled. "Make a wish," somebody called out. Linda laughed softly before blowing out the candles in one breath. Everyone applauded. My mother actually wiped tears from the corners of her eyes. "I am just so grateful we are all together," she said warmly. The sentence echoed strangely inside my chest. All together. Richard had been dead for 23 days, and somehow I had never felt more alone sitting among people carrying my own last name. Claire quietly set down her napkin. "I need some air," she murmured. I nodded gently and watched her disappear through the side gate toward the front yard. My mother barely noticed. She was too busy serving slices of cake onto floral dessert plates she had owned since the 1980s. "Evelyn," she said suddenly, "would you mind helping me carry coffee from the kitchen?" Of course. I stood immediately because I had spent my entire life standing immediately whenever my family needed something. Inside the house, the silence felt heavier without the forced cheerfulness from outside. My mother moved around the kitchen quickly, opening cabinets and rearranging mugs while I filled the coffee tray beside the sink. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then she sighed softly without looking at me. "I know tonight must feel difficult for you." I stared down at the coffee cups. "Difficult? You are still grieving," she said carefully, almost cautiously, as though grief were a stain she did not want spreading onto the evening. "But I hope you understand why I wanted tonight to stay lighthearted for Linda." I turned slowly toward her. "Richard died 3 weeks ago." "I know that." "Do you?" The question escaped more quietly than I intended. My mother finally looked at me directly. "Evelyn, please do not do this tonight." There it was again. The familiar warning hidden beneath politeness. Do not make things uncomfortable. Do not ruin the mood. Do not bring your pain into rooms already arranged around somebody else's happiness. I lowered my eyes again because arguing suddenly felt exhausting. "I am not trying to do anything," I said softly. "I came because you invited me." My mother pressed her lips together briefly. "Linda has been through a lot too." I almost laughed. Not cruelly. Not bitterly. Just from pure disbelief. My husband had died in our kitchen while reaching for his heart, and somehow we were still comparing emotional inconveniences around my sister like contestants in some terrible competition. I carried the coffee tray back outside without another word. The night air had cooled slightly. Crickets hummed beyond the fence while distant traffic drifted softly through the quiet neighborhood streets. Everyone had moved closer together around the table except for Claire, who now stood alone near the driveway with her arms folded tightly across her chest. My father accepted a coffee cup from me without noticing my trembling hands. "Thanks, sweetheart," he said absently before returning to his conversation with Linda about vacation rentals in Vermont. Sweetheart. He had not called me that once during the weeks after Richard died. But here, surrounded by witnesses, the old affectionate habits returned easily. Claire walked back toward the patio slowly. Her eyes met mine for only a second before she sat beside me again. "You okay?" she whispered. I nodded automatically. "Mom," she said quietly, "you do not have to keep pretending." I looked away because I suddenly felt dangerously close to tears. Across the table, Linda was describing a spa package somebody had gifted her after the divorce. "Honestly," she laughed, "it was the first time in months I finally felt cared for." My mother reached over immediately and squeezed her hand sympathetically. Something inside me shifted then. Not dramatically, not loudly, just a small internal movement like ice cracking beneath still water. Because I realized I could not remember the last time anyone at this table had reached for my hand after pain. When Richard was diagnosed with congestive heart failure 2 years earlier, my parents sent a fruit basket. Linda mailed a generic sympathy card after his surgery. Claire was the one who slept overnight in hospital chairs beside me. Claire was the one who drove me home after the funeral because I could not stop shaking long enough to hold the steering wheel. Claire was the one checking whether I had eaten dinner each night since becoming a widow. My family offered politeness. My daughter offered love. There was a difference I had ignored for far too long. "Can we take a family picture before everyone leaves?" Josh suddenly asked, already lifting his phone. Chairs scraped against the patio as people stood and gathered together near the lanterns. My mother immediately positioned herself beside Linda. My father wrapped an arm proudly around my sister's shoulders. Somebody called Claire closer toward the center. I stayed near the edge of the patio waiting for someone to notice I had not moved into the frame. Nobody did. Not at first. They smiled toward the camera while I stood holding an untouched cup of coffee beside the table like an extra guest who happened to wander into the wrong backyard. Then Claire lowered her phone slowly and looked directly at me, standing alone beneath the patio lights. And the expression on my daughter's face changed completely. Claire did not smile when the picture was taken. Everyone else gathered beneath the lantern lights with polished expressions and wine glasses raised casually toward the camera, but my daughter stood stiff beside the table, staring directly at me instead of the phone. I realized then that she was not seeing the same evening everyone else pretended to enjoy. She was seeing me standing alone while my own family forgot to make space for me again. "Come on, Claire," Linda called lightly after the flash went off. "At least fake a smile for one picture." Claire lowered the phone slowly. "I am trying," she replied. Something in her voice caused a brief, uncomfortable pause around the table. My mother cleared her throat quickly and began collecting empty dessert plates as though she could physically tidy away tension before it settled anywhere permanent. "Who wants coffee refills?" she asked too brightly. Nobody answered immediately. The air had changed. I could feel it. Small shifts like that used to terrify me because I had spent decades smoothing them over before conflict could bloom into something visible. Richard used to joke that I could sense discomfort the way some people sense thunderstorms. "You rush to fix things before anybody even realizes they are broken," he once told me while we washed dishes together after Christmas dinner years ago. At the time, I thought he was complimenting me. Standing there beside the patio table, I finally understood he had been quietly worried about me all along. Claire walked over and picked up my untouched coffee cup before it could spill from my trembling hands. "It is cold," she said softly. "I will get you another one." "Honey, I am fine." "No," she replied gently. "You are not." My mother glanced toward us from the kitchen doorway. I saw irritation flicker briefly across her face before she masked it with another careful smile. "Claire, sweetheart, your mother has always been emotional during family events. Do not make too much of it." Emotional. There was that word again. I wondered how many years of my life had been reduced into that single dismissive label whenever my feelings inconvenienced somebody else. Claire stared at her grandmother for several long seconds. "She buried her husband 3 weeks ago," she said quietly. "That is not being emotional. That is being human." Nobody moved. My father suddenly became very interested in folding his napkin. Linda looked down at her wine glass. The neighbors exchanged awkward glances that made me want to disappear completely. I hated scenes. I hated tension. I especially hated becoming the reason people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Claire, I whispered carefully, please. She turned toward me immediately. The anger on her face softened the second she looked into my eyes. Mom, she said, almost pleading now, why are you still protecting them? The question hit harder than anything else that evening because I did not have an answer. Or maybe I did. Maybe children who grow up competing quietly for affection eventually learn to survive by becoming easier to love. Less demanding, less noticeable. Linda had always been radiant in the loud, effortless way people admire immediately. She was beautiful in photographs, funny at parties, charming with strangers. I was dependable, useful. The daughter who remembered birthdays, handled hospital paperwork, called during storms to make sure the furnace still worked. My parents praised Linda publicly and relied on me privately. Somehow I convinced myself that counted as love. Claire set my fresh coffee cup carefully onto the table. Do you remember Dad's last birthday? She asked suddenly. I blinked in surprise. Of course. Grandpa and Grandma canceled dinner because Aunt Linda wanted to go to a concert. My mother's expression tightened immediately. That is not what happened. Really? Claire asked calmly. Because I remember Mom spending 2 days making lasagna from scratch before everybody canceled 4 hours beforehand. Linda already had tickets, my father muttered weakly. Claire gave a short, disbelieving laugh. Exactly. Silence spread slowly across the patio again. The lantern lights swayed gently overhead while distant dogs barked somewhere beyond the neighborhood fences. Tiny, ordinary sounds continued around us, while something enormous cracked open inside me. Memories began surfacing faster now. My father missing Claire's high school graduation because Linda needed help moving apartments. My mother leaving Richard alone after surgery because Linda felt anxious about turning 50. Every disappointment had arrived wrapped inside reasonable explanations. Individually, they seemed small enough to forgive. Together, they formed a lifetime. I think everybody is tired, my mother said finally, her voice thinner now. Perhaps we should just enjoy the rest of the evening peacefully. Peacefully. Another familiar family word. It never meant honesty. It meant silence. Claire looked at her grandmother steadily. Peace for who? My mother blinked. Excuse me. You keep talking about protecting the mood. Keeping things positive. Staying peaceful. Claire's voice remained calm, but each word landed heavily now. You are protecting everybody from Mom's grief instead of protecting Mom from being alone in it. I closed my eyes briefly because hearing someone speak aloud what I had spent years swallowing felt almost unbearable. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Claire, nobody is trying to hurt your mother. That is the problem, she replied softly. You do not even notice when you do. Linda stood abruptly and picked up her purse. I am not going to sit here being attacked on my birthday. Nobody attacked you, Claire answered. You just finally had to listen. The words settled over the table with terrifying clarity. For the first time all evening, nobody interrupted her. Nobody redirected the conversation. Nobody reached for another cheerful distraction. They simply sat there staring at my daughter while the truth moved. Slowly through the silence like smoke. My mother was the first person to break eye contact. She picked up a stack of dessert plates with trembling hands and carried them toward the kitchen too quickly, as though movement alone could save her from hearing the rest of the conversation. Linda exhaled sharply and crossed her arms over her chest. This is unbelievable, she muttered. I invited everyone here for one nice evening, and somehow I became the villain. Claire looked at her quietly. Nobody made you the villain, Aunt Linda. Oh please, Linda snapped. Do not act like I have done something terrible just because I wanted one normal birthday dinner. I watched my daughter carefully choose her next words. That was something Claire inherited from Richard. He always paused before speaking during difficult moments, almost like he respected silence enough to think through what belonged inside it. Nobody is upset that you had a birthday dinner, Claire said softly. They are upset because Mom lost her husband less than a month ago, and everybody here acted like her grief was ruining the atmosphere. My father rubbed a hand across his forehead. That is not fair. Then what part is fair? Claire asked. The part where Grandma skipped over every photo with Dad in it? Or the part where nobody even noticed Mom standing alone during the family picture? I felt heat rise into my face immediately. Claire, honey, please stop. But she did not look at me this time. She kept her eyes fixed on the rest of the table. No, she said quietly. Somebody should say it. Linda laughed bitterly and grabbed her wine glass again. You are being dramatic. That word settled over the patio like cold rain. Dramatic. Another label women in this family received whenever they finally became too honest to ignore. Claire leaned back slowly in her chair. You know what is interesting? She said calmly. Mom spent years teaching me to excuse this behavior because she thought family loyalty mattered more than being treated with kindness. My throat tightened instantly. She was right. I had taught her that. Every missed milestone, every canceled dinner, every subtle humiliation wrapped inside polite smiles. I always found a reason to explain it away for her. Your aunt is stressed. Grandpa did not mean it like that. Grandma is just overwhelmed. I had spent decades translating disappointment into acceptable language because the alternative would have forced me to admit something painful. I was never loved the way Linda was. My father finally stood from his chair. That is enough for tonight. His voice was firm but tired. Everybody is emotional. Claire gave a small sad smile at that. Notice how grief always becomes Mom's personality flaw instead of something deserving compassion. Nobody answered her. The neighbors had stopped pretending not to listen several minutes earlier. One of them quietly gathered her purse and whispered something about getting home before it became too late. I almost envied her ability to leave so easily. My mother returned from the kitchen carrying fresh coffee nobody asked for. Her mascara looked slightly smudged now. I think Claire owes your aunt an apology, she said carefully while setting mugs onto the table. Claire stared at her grandmother in disbelief. For what? For embarrassing the family. The sentence landed softly, but something inside me finally cracked open completely. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the quiet realization that my humiliation had never embarrassed this family. Only my daughter acknowledging it did. Claire laughed once under her breath. Not cruelly, just tired. That is the problem right there. My mother blinked. What does that mean? Claire looked around the table slowly before answering. Everybody here is more uncomfortable hearing about Mom's pain than watching her live through it. Silence again. Heavy this time. My father sank back into his chair without speaking. Linda stared down into her coffee cup. Even my mother looked shaken now, though whether from guilt or frustration, I could not tell anymore. I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate because my hands would not stop trembling. I did not want this, I whispered softly. Every head turned toward me. My voice sounded smaller than I intended. I did not come here to ruin anything. Nobody said you ruined anything, my mother replied quickly, but the words felt automatic now. Hollow, like something repeated too many times to still contain truth. I looked around the table slowly. The lanterns overhead swayed gently in the night breeze. Half-finished slices of cake sat abandoned beside melting scoops of vanilla ice cream. Somebody's forgotten sweater rested across the back of a chair. Ordinary objects. Ordinary family dinner details. Yet suddenly everything looked painfully unfamiliar to me. Richard used to tell me I apologized too much, I said quietly. My father shifted slightly at the mention of my husband's name. Even when something hurt me, I still worried more about making everyone else comfortable. I swallowed hard before continuing. I think maybe he understood something I did not. Claire reached for my hand beneath the table. Warm fingers, steady grip. Real love always felt calm to me. Not loud, not performative, just present. Linda finally sighed heavily and stood from her chair. I cannot do this tonight. She grabbed her purse and car keys with exaggerated frustration. Everything always turns into some emotional trial with this family. I watched her disappear toward the driveway without anybody stopping her. My mother looked exhausted now. Older somehow. Evelyn, she said softly, you know we love you. I met her eyes for several long seconds before answering. And for the first time in my entire life, I allowed myself to notice how desperately I had waited to hear those words from her. I think you love me when I am quiet, I said gently. My mother's face fell immediately. My father looked down at the table again. Claire squeezed my hand tighter beneath the lantern lights while the silence around us finally stopped feeling empty. It felt honest. Nobody spoke for several seconds after that. The silence felt different now. Earlier in the evening, silence had been avoidance. This silence felt exposed. Honest in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. My mother slowly sat down across from me again, folding her hands tightly together on the tablecloth. The tiny gold bracelet on her wrist caught the lantern light as her fingers trembled slightly. I noticed things like that now. Little cracks in people I used to overlook because I was too busy protecting them from consequences. Claire remained beside me, her hand still resting gently over mine beneath the table. I realized then how long it had been since someone held my hand without expecting me to feel better immediately afterward. My father cleared his throat awkwardly. Nobody meant for tonight to become painful. I almost answered automatically. That old reflex rose inside me before I could stop it. It is okay. I understand. Let us move on. But the words stayed trapped behind my teeth this time. Because for once, I was tired of helping everyone escape discomfort they created themselves. Claire spoke before I could respond anyway. Painful for who? She asked quietly. My father looked exhausted now. For everyone. No, Claire replied gently. Mom has been in pain for weeks. Tonight is just the first time everybody else had to sit near it for 10 minutes. My mother looked down at the table immediately. Her voice sounded smaller when she finally spoke again. We did not know what to say to her after Richard passed. I stared at her in disbelief. You are my mother. The words escaped softly, but they seemed to wound her more than shouting ever could have. She blinked rapidly and looked away. I know. No, I whispered carefully. I do not think you do. The night breeze shifted the lanterns overhead again. Somewhere beyond the fence, a car door slammed shut. Linda had probably already driven away by now, furious that her birthday dinner no longer revolved entirely around her. Strangely, I did not feel guilty about that anymore. Claire leaned back in her chair and studied my grandparents quietly. Do you know what Mom did the morning after Dad died? She asked. Neither of them answered. She baked muffins for the neighbors because she felt bad that the ambulance woke people up at 6 in the morning. My throat tightened painfully. I had forgotten about that. Flowers still dusted across the kitchen counter. Richard's favorite coffee mug sitting untouched beside the sink, while I mechanically measured blueberries into batter because grief had not fully reached my body yet. Sometimes shock disguises itself as routine. Mom spent her entire life making sure everyone else stayed comfortable. Claire continued softly. And somehow you all still treated her like she was difficult the second she finally needed something back. My father rubbed both hands slowly across his face. Older men often look most fragile when they run out of explanations. That is not fair, he muttered again, though this time the words sounded weaker. Your mother was always independent. Independent. Another family translation. It meant do not ask for help. It meant survive quietly. It meant if you are strong long enough, people stop noticing when you break. I looked toward the empty chair where Linda had been sitting earlier. Half a slice of birthday cake still rested untouched beside her abandoned coffee cup. For years I convinced myself my sister received more attention because she needed it more. Linda was sensitive. Linda was impulsive. Linda struggled after heartbreaks. Meanwhile, I became efficient, responsible, reliable. Families reward the child who appears easiest to lose because they assume the dependable one will always remain waiting nearby. Claire squeezed my hand again before standing slowly from her chair. I am going to grab Mom's coat from inside, she said quietly. Once she disappeared into the house, the patio felt colder immediately. My mother stared after her for several long seconds. She is angry with us. She is protective of me, I corrected softly. The distinction mattered. My mother's eyes filled unexpectedly with tears then. Real tears this time. Not polite emotional gestures performed during birthday toasts. I never wanted you to feel unloved. I believed she meant that, which somehow made everything sadder. Because people can fail you deeply without ever intending cruelty. Sometimes neglect grows slowly inside ordinary habits until it becomes invisible to everyone except the person carrying its weight. Do you know what hurt the most tonight? I asked quietly. My parents looked at me carefully. It was not the birthday dinner. It was realizing nobody here noticed I disappeared emotionally long before Richard died. My father stared down at the table again. My mother pressed trembling fingers against her lips. After the funeral, I continued softly. Claire stayed with me every night for a week because she was afraid I would stop eating. Neither of you called once after the second day. My mother inhaled sharply. I thought you needed space. No, I whispered. You just assumed I would survive without comfort because I always have before. The truth settled heavily between us. Not dramatic, not explosive, just undeniable now. Claire returned carrying my coat folded carefully across her arm. It is getting late, she said gently. I nodded slowly and stood from the table. My knees felt weak from exhaustion more than emotion now. My mother rose quickly too. Evelyn, please do not leave like this. Like this. Honest. Quiet. Awake. I slipped my arms carefully into my coat while looking around the patio one final time. The candles had nearly burned down completely. Melted wax pooled around their bases in soft, uneven shapes. The family picture still glowed faintly on Josh's forgotten phone screen near the empty dessert plates. Everyone smiling beneath warm lantern lights. Everyone together except me. Claire stepped beside me near the gate. I looked back at my parents standing silently under the swaying lights, suddenly smaller than they had seemed my entire life. I spent years thinking love meant being the person who tolerated the most pain, I said softly. Richard tried to teach me otherwise. Claire finally did. Neither of my parents spoke as we walked toward the driveway. And for the first time in my life, I did not turn back hoping they would. The drive home felt strangely quiet, but not heavy in the way I expected. Claire kept both hands on the steering wheel while soft jazz played low through the speakers. Streetlights passed across the windshield in slow golden patterns as we moved through the sleeping Connecticut suburbs. For several miles, neither of us spoke. I sat staring out the passenger window at darkened houses with glowing kitchen lights, wondering how many families inside those homes were also pretending not to hurt each other. My chest still ached, but the feeling had changed shape. Earlier that evening, the pain felt sharp and humiliating. Now it felt tired, like something inside me had finally stopped fighting reality hard enough to stay wounded by it. Claire broke the silence first. "Are you angry with me?" she asked softly. I turned toward her immediately. "No, I know I should not have said all of that in front of everyone." "Yes," I admitted quietly. "You probably should not have." She nodded once, accepting it. But I could not keep watching them do it. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. That was when I realized how deeply tonight had hurt her too. Children carry invisible grief when they watch someone they love settle for less kindness than they deserve. Claire had spent years witnessing me shrink myself around my family without understanding fully why it bothered her so much. Tonight simply gave language to feelings she had carried for a long time. "I am sorry," I whispered suddenly. She looked over in confusion. "For what?" I folded my hands tightly in my lap. "For teaching you that love meant enduring things silently." Claire's eyes softened instantly. "Mom." "No, it is true." I stared down at my wedding ring resting against my fingers beneath the dashboard light. I spent so many years trying to keep peace that I forgot peace is supposed to include me too. Claire pulled into the driveway of my house just after 11 o'clock. The porch lights still glowed softly against the white siding Richard painted himself 12 summers earlier. He insisted on doing every inch by hand, even after the contractor offered to spray it faster. A home should look cared for, he told me back then while balancing on a ladder in old jeans stained with paint. Standing there now, I could almost still hear his voice in the quiet night air. Claire parked the car, but did not unbuckle immediately. "Do you want me to stay tonight?" she asked. I knew she was tired. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes from too many sleepless weeks spent checking on me. Yet she still asked gently, without obligation. Real love always leaves room for choice. "No," I said softly after a moment. "I think I need to be alone tonight." Concern flickered across her face immediately. "Are you sure?" I nodded slowly. "For the first time in weeks, I actually am." Claire walked me to the front porch anyway. The night smelled faintly of rain and fresh-cut grass. Somewhere nearby, sprinklers clicked rhythmically across somebody's lawn. Ordinary suburban sounds. Familiar. Steady. Inside the house, silence greeted us immediately. But unlike before, it no longer felt abandoned. It simply felt honest. Claire placed my purse carefully on the kitchen counter while I slipped off my coat. Richard's reading glasses still rested beside the coffee maker exactly where I left them. Usually seeing them shattered me. Tonight, I walked over and touched them gently with my fingertips. "Dad would have been proud of you tonight," Claire said quietly behind me. Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. Richard hated unfairness in quiet ways. He never raised his voice much, but he noticed everything. Every time my mother interrupted me at dinner. Every time Linda expected favors without gratitude. Every holiday where I returned home emotionally exhausted after trying too hard to earn warmth that should have come naturally. "You do not have to keep proving your worth to people who already decided not to value it," he told me once after a Christmas dinner years ago. I remember brushing off the comment immediately. I thought he simply misunderstood my family dynamic. Now I wondered whether he understood it better than I ever allowed myself to. Claire stepped closer and wrapped her arms around me carefully. I leaned into the hug longer than usual. "Thank you," I whispered. "For what?" "For seeing me." She held me tighter after that. We stood there together in the quiet kitchen while the refrigerator hummed softly and the old clock above the stove ticked toward midnight. Eventually, Claire kissed my cheek and headed toward the front door. "Call me if you need anything," she said gently. "Anything at all." After she left, I locked the door and wandered slowly through the house, turning off lights one room at a time. The living room still smelled faintly like Richard's cedar aftershave. A folded blanket rested on his recliner where he left it the week before he died. For the first time since the funeral, I did not break apart looking at it. I simply sat down beside the chair and allowed myself to remember him without panic. The way he always warmed my side of the bed before winter nights. The way he kissed my forehead while reading newspapers on Sunday mornings. The way he noticed immediately whenever I became too quiet after visiting my parents. Somewhere between midnight and 1 in the morning, my phone buzzed softly on the side table. A message from my mother. "I hope you got home safely. I never wanted you to feel unloved." I stared at the screen for a very long time before setting the phone back down without answering. Because for once, I understood something clearly. Intentions do not erase impact. And love that only appears when silence breaks is not the same thing as love that protects you before you have to ask for it. I sat there alone beside Richard's empty chair while rain finally began tapping softly against the windows. And for the first time in my life, loneliness no longer felt like punishment. It felt like the beginning of freedom. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise for the first time since Richard died, without feeling panic rush through my chest. Usually mornings were the hardest. Grief feels cruelest in daylight because the world resumes ordinary routines while your own life still feels shattered. But that morning, something felt quieter inside me. Not healed, just clearer. Rain still clung to the windows from the storm during the night. The kitchen smelled faintly like coffee grounds and old cedar from Richard's coat, hanging near the back door. I stood there in my robes staring out at the wet backyard while the coffee maker hummed softly beside me. Then my phone buzzed again on the counter. Another message from my mother. "Please call me when you wake up." I looked at the words for several seconds before placing the phone face down again. 20 years ago, I would have answered immediately. 10 years ago, I would have worried she felt guilty. 5 years ago, I would have apologized somehow just to make the discomfort disappear faster. But grief changes strange things inside people. Losing Richard stripped away my ability to keep performing emotional labor for everyone else while neglecting myself. I carried my coffee into the living room and sat beside the window Richard loved most. He used to read there every Sunday morning with newspapers spread across the coffee table and jazz music playing softly through the speakers. Sometimes he would glance up from an article and say something random like, "You know, Evelyn, you always tense your shoulders before your mother calls." I never even realized I did that until he pointed it out. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Linda. "You embarrassed everyone last night." I stared at the message without emotion. Not sadness. Not anger. Just recognition. Of course that would be her version of events. In Linda's world, discomfort itself was the offense. Not what caused it. A few seconds later another message appeared. "Mom cried after you left." I almost replied automatically. I almost asked whether my mother was okay. But then I remembered sitting alone during the family picture while nobody noticed I was missing from it. I remembered my mother skipping past Richard's photograph. I remembered hearing, "We wanted tonight to stay positive," while trying not to break apart at the dinner table. For the first time in my life, I allowed someone else's feelings to remain their responsibility. Around 10 o'clock, Claire arrived carrying grocery bags and a bouquet of white daisies. "You forgot to eat breakfast yesterday," she said immediately after stepping inside. I smiled faintly despite myself. "Good morning to you too." She set groceries onto the kitchen counter while I arranged the flowers in an old glass pitcher. Richard loved daisies because he said they looked honest. "Grandma called me 3 times already," Claire admitted quietly while unpacking fruit and soup containers into the refrigerator. I did not answer. I nodded slowly. "You do not have to take sides, sweetheart." Claire looked at me carefully. "I am not taking sides. I am protecting peace." The sentence stopped me completely because I realized she had learned the difference before I ever did. Protecting peace is not the same thing as protecting denial. One creates healing. The other creates silence. Claire handed me a bowl of strawberries after washing them carefully at the sink. "Do you know what bothered me most last night?" she asked softly. I leaned against the counter. "What?" "Watching you apologize for existing in pain." My chest tightened unexpectedly. I was not apologizing. Claire gave me a gentle, sad look. "Mom, you apologized 3 separate times just for crying." I opened my mouth to argue before stopping completely. Because she was right. I had apologized in the kitchen, at the table, near the driveway before leaving. I spent my entire life believing my emotions became more acceptable if I minimized them first. Richard used to notice that too. "You say sorry before every honest feeling," he once told me while we folded laundry together years ago. "Like you are asking permission to be human." I sat down slowly at the kitchen table while Claire made tea. Sunlight finally began breaking through the clouds outside, leaving pale gold reflections across the wet backyard grass. Everything looked freshly washed. Around noon, my father called. I let the phone ring twice before answering. "Hi, Dad." His voice sounded uncertain immediately. Older somehow. "Your mother is very upset." I closed my eyes briefly. Of course she was. I am sure she is. She did not sleep last night. Neither did I. Silence stretched between us for several seconds. Then he sighed heavily. Claire was harsh. I stared out the kitchen window at rainwater dripping slowly from the porch railing. Was she wrong? My father did not answer immediately. I could hear him breathing softly through the phone. Finally he said, "Families are complicated." I almost laughed. Another familiar phrase. Families are complicated. Translation: endure things quietly because confronting them threatens comfort. "Dad," I said gently, "do you know what is strange?" "What?" I spent years thinking being loved meant being endlessly understanding. My voice remained calm now. Steady. But Richard loved me best whenever I was honest. My father grew quiet again. I wondered suddenly whether he spent his whole life making the same mistakes my mother did simply because it felt easier than questioning family patterns too late. "Your mother misses you," he said eventually. I swallowed hard before answering. "I think she misses the version of me who never said anything." After we hung up, I stood alone in the kitchen for a long time staring at the silent phone in my hand. Then I walked to the hallway closet, pulled out an old cardboard box, and finally packed away the sweater I wore to Linda's birthday dinner. Not because it carried painful memories, but because I no longer needed clothes chosen for making myself appear smaller. 3 weeks passed before I saw my parents again. In that time, my mother called almost every day. Sometimes she left voicemails asking whether I was eating enough. Sometimes she cried softly into the phone saying she missed me. My father sent short text messages about weather updates and neighborhood gossip, as though ordinary conversation could quietly carry us back into old patterns without addressing anything that actually happened. Linda never apologized. She sent exactly one message. "I hope you are happy with all the drama you caused." I deleted it without responding. The strange thing was, silence no longer frightened me. For most of my life, silence felt dangerous because it meant disapproval, distance, punishment. But once I stopped scrambling to repair every uncomfortable feeling inside my family, I discovered something unexpected. Peace became possible. Real peace. The kind Richard always wanted for me. Claire visited nearly every evening after work. Sometimes we cooked dinner together while old jazz albums played softly through the kitchen speakers. Sometimes we simply sat on the back porch wrapped in blankets watching sunset colors stretch across the trees behind the house. Grief still lived inside me, of course. Losing Richard would ache forever in certain quiet moments. Passing his favorite cereal at the grocery store. Reaching for a second coffee mug each morning before remembering. Hearing a joke he would have loved and realizing there was nobody left to tell it to. But beneath the grief, another feeling slowly began growing stronger. Relief. Not because I lost my family, because I finally stopped chasing affection that always came with conditions attached. One Saturday afternoon in early October, Claire convinced me to visit a small farmer's market downtown. The air smelled like cinnamon and roasted pecans while local musicians played acoustic guitars near the food trucks. I wore a dark green sweater Richard bought me years ago, but that I rarely used because my mother once said the color made me look older. Halfway through choosing apples from a wooden crate, Claire looked over at me and smiled suddenly. "You seem lighter." I laughed softly. "Lighter?" "Yeah." She adjusted the scarf around her neck. Like you are not waiting for permission anymore. The comment stayed with me the entire drive home. That evening, while folding laundry in the quiet living room, I realized she was right. My whole life revolved around earning emotional safety from people who offered it sparingly. Every holiday, every phone call, every dinner, I monitored moods the way some people monitored weather forecasts. But Richard never made me earn softness from him. Claire did not either. Love should not feel like a performance review. A few days later, my mother appeared unexpectedly at my front door, holding a casserole dish wrapped in foil. I almost did not answer because I recognized her car through the curtains immediately. But eventually I opened the door anyway. She looked smaller standing there on the porch than I remembered. Not weaker exactly, just older. Human in ways parents rarely seem while you are still trying desperately to please them. I made chicken pot pie, she said awkwardly. You always liked it during colder weather. I stepped aside quietly and let her inside. We sat together at the kitchen table where afternoon sunlight slanted softly across the wood grain Richard refinished by hand years earlier. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then my mother looked down at her folded hands and whispered, I keep replaying that dinner in my head. I waited silently. Your father says Claire was disrespectful, she admitted softly. But part of me thinks she was brave. Tears filled her eyes almost. Immediately after saying it, I do not know when I stopped noticing your loneliness. Her honesty hurt more than excuses would have, because deep down, I knew she loved me in the only way she understood how. The tragedy was that her version of love always demanded silence before comfort. Mom, I said gently, I spent years pretending things did not hurt because I thought being easy to love was the same thing as being loved. She covered her mouth briefly as tears slipped down her cheeks. I never wanted that for you. I know. And for the first time in my life, I actually meant it. We sat there together quietly while the kitchen clock ticked softly behind us. No dramatic confrontation. No screaming. Just two aging women finally seeing each other clearly after decades of misunderstanding disguised as family normalcy. Before leaving, my mother paused beside the front door and looked at me carefully. Claire loves you fiercely, she said softly. I smiled through sudden tears. Yes, I whispered. She does. After she left, I walked slowly through the house, turning on lamps against the early autumn darkness. The living room glowed warm beneath soft yellow light. Richard's recliner still sat beside the bookshelf. His reading glasses still rested near the window. But the house no longer felt frozen in grief. It felt lived in again. Later that night, Claire called while driving home from work. How are you doing? She asked immediately. I leaned back against the couch and looked around the quiet room. Honestly, always. I smiled softly. For the first time in my life, I think I finally understand what love is supposed to feel like. Claire grew quiet on the other end of the phone. Then she asked gently, what does it feel like? I glanced toward the empty chair beside the window where Richard used to sit reading newspapers every Sunday morning. And suddenly the answer came easily. Safe, I whispered. It feels safe.